On today's FaithWorks, we visit with Sister Helen Prejean, here in Fresno to promote the opera based on her memoir, Dead Man Walking. Hello again and welcome to FaithWorks. In this particular program, I am so privileged and am so honored to have a very special guest whom all of you will know the minute you see her. Sister Helen Prejean, a sister of the Congregation of St. Joseph, the beautiful sisters who have done so much for us in education, is going to be sharing with us her journey, her own faith growth over her vocation as a sister. I'd like to let Sister tell us something, but before I do, I'd like to say something from a book that I read recently. Oh, it's by Sister, by the way, The Death of Innocence. And here's what she says. When I started out as a young Catholic nun teaching religion and English in junior high at St. Francis Cabrini in New Orleans, I never thought I would enter the surreal world of government-killing chambers. I was profoundly naive about the criminal justice system, the courts, and the horrendous sorrow of murder victims' families. Only when I lived among poor people did I become involved with death row prisoners. And she continues. Sister, can you begin by leading us into your journey as you'd like to share it with people that need to see that even a religious can have a conversion and find deeper growth in their own spiritual life as they progress in sensitivity towards the poor?
Well, for me, the way I talk about grace is that God wakes us up. And so for a long time, I was a sister working at a DRE in a parish. Always have loved what I've done, but I was always working in the suburbs. I was never in the inner city in New Orleans, where over 50% of our population is in poverty. And it was an awakening to the deeper dimension of the gospel, the way Pope Francis is calling us to, that Jesus is calling us to be with the marginated and the people who are despised and hated and ignored and disregarded. And I awakened that to be a real follower of Jesus meant I had to do more than praying for the world. My prayer life was always important to me, my spiritual life. But it was to work for justice. And at first I didn't get it about justice because I'd grown up in privilege and I didn't know the importance. It was more than about just being charitable to people, being kind. There were systems that were wrong. There was racism in our city, and I'd grown up in privilege. And the awakening was that to really follow Christ, I needed to be on the side of poor people, and I didn't even know any poor people. And so I moved into the St. Thomas housing project.
So how did that happen for you, the idea of finally being in an environment at St. Thomas? How did that happen for you?
Just what I said. I knew I had to wake up to poor people, didn't even know poor people, then made a decision and moved into the St. Thomas housing projects in New Orleans among my African-American neighbors that I'd never known. Worked at a place called Hope House, and I didn't go there to save African-American people. I went there to learn. I sat at their feet and I learned about the other America. I learned about what happened to young black kids, guys especially, with the police, what happened in the public schools. I was always in the Catholic school system and was given a wonderful education. Kids are coming in who had gotten to their junior year in public school, couldn't even read a third grade reader, sat in charity hospital with people who didn't have health care, wait till 2 o'clock in the morning till a young intern's going to learn medicine from Geraldine Johnson's very sick child. And everything looked different to me. And so I began to learn. I began to read. And it was while I was there that one day, coming out of Hope House, out of the Adult Learning Center, I got an invitation to write A Man on Death Row. And that's the first story in Dead Man Walking. That's the first book I ever wrote.
Tell us a little bit about that, about how it was that you accepted that offer, that challenge, and then meeting and being so present to Patrick Saunier. Tell us about that, how that came to be and what it did for you.
Yeah, well, I wrote just thinking that I was only going to be a pen pal. I didn't know that this person would be executed 2.5 years later. I like to tease a little bit that Jesus is sneaky when, you know, Jesus, that little call comes, hey, why don't you write a letter to a death row inmate? I'm going, oh, I'm an English major. I could write a letter, you know, I could send poems. And 2 years later, I'm standing in the killing chamber with him, and they're strapping him in to electrocute him to death. And he's looking at me and looking at my face. And all of grace unfurls in us like a flower. First, the awareness, the awakening, you set out on the path. I couldn't have the whole little blueprint all laid out. No. Just didn't know. Meet him, knew that he was there, because everybody on death row is called the worst of the worst. Oh, yeah. So I expected to see the face. I thought it would show on your face if you had murdered somebody, that you must be mean, or like your eyes are. And I couldn't believe how human he was when I saw him through this heavy mesh metal grate. And so that was my first, oh my God, he's human. And I had a realization that never left me. And it was, I didn't know what he had done yet, I will find out. Wow. But I thought to myself, whatever he has done, he is worth more than that one terrible act of his life. We are all worth more than the worst thing we've ever done. And the journey began first with him, meeting him, seeing him as a person, and then I found out about the crime. And he and his brother, in cold blood, had killed a young teenage couple who had gone to a place near a sugarcane field to park. It was a little like local lover's lane. And Pat and his brother had in cold blood killed those two kids, shot them in the back of the head. And when I found out what they had done, I was, of course, horrified. I understand when people say, I'm for the death penalty, look at that crime, they deserve to die for what they did. Because the outrage in us is so great when innocent people are killed like that. But then I made a terrible mistake because I thought of the parents. And I thought, this is every parent's worst nightmare. Oh, yeah. Their kids had gone to a Catholic high homecoming football game on a Friday night, and they never came home. And when I realized the crime, and then I thought of the parents, and I thought of reaching out to them naturally. But then I held back because I thought, they're not going to want to see me. I'm the spiritual advisor to the two people who killed their children. And I stayed away from the victims' families. It was the worst mistake I ever made in my life. And then when I met them, it couldn't have been at a worse time, because it was during the pardon board hearing, where you actually sign a book in Louisiana. When you have a pardon board hearing before somebody's executed, you sign a book which side you're on. Literally, life or death. And I was there to ask them not to execute Patrick Saunier, and that's when I met the victims' parents.
But you were on a learning curve anyways, because everything with Patrick was the first time.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of finding out what the criminal justice system or lack thereof is. What were some other lessons that you became rudely awakened to as you are ministering to Pat?
Well, I learned through a lawyer I got to come help Pat, because he had had such poor defense at his trial. His lawyer actually met with him 1/2 hour before he went to trial, like it was. And so I began to learn how the legal system works. I thought we had the best court system in the world in the United States. And at least if you were up for your life, that you would have a decent defense. And I began to learn how one of the drawbacks when you don't have good defense at a death penalty trial is if that lawyer at your side does not enter in formal objections to what's going on, then the appeals courts will not look at that as an issue. You know, Dobie Williams, in the first story in Death Vengeance, he watched as an all-white jury was sat in this little town in Manny, Louisiana. He was accused of killing a white woman in her bathroom in this little racist town. And here's an all-white jury being seated for him to be the jury of his peers, the impartial jury of his peers, and the lawyer did not raise a formal objection. So when it went even up to the Supreme Court, they said your lawyer didn't raise an objection, and what they figure is, oh, so the two of you talked it over, you strategized, and you figured these people were going to be the best. I had no idea how crucial the whole legal part of it was. I knew to have a good doctor meant a difference because my grandmother had been very sick, and they got her a good doctor. And diagnosis is 90%, and that doctor saved her life. But when you have a lawyer by your side and your life is on the line, and they don't get crucial things in to help that jury, and I realized I don't know anything about this. And the lawyers are my heroes, these public defenders, these people that take these appeal cases pro bono, get no money for it. And so I was learning about the legal system. Then I learned about how, though the theory of the death penalty is it's reserved only for the worst of the worst, and race plays a huge part in it. The race of the victims. You'd say, oh, well, look, you got black and white, people of color on death row. But it's the race of the victims. It's overwhelmingly 8 out of every 10 people on death row are there because a white person was killed. And boy, I'd see this in New Orleans all the time. Whenever a white person's killed, it's on the front page of the Times-Picayune, our newspaper. When people were killed in the projects, you couldn't even find it on page 30 because if a life is negligible, a death is negligible, and you're not going to be outraged over the death. And I just began to, I was learning everything.
Yeah.
I was learning everything.
The geography of this, by which in the South there is still such a preponderance of persons on death row, of capital crimes, capital punishment, and it is not even across the country. Well, it's not. It's almost like in certain states, they are the ones that are just unable to appreciate anything that we're talking about today.
You want to hear something interesting? The Bible Belt and the Death Belt are the same states. And the real practitioners of the death penalty are the 10 southern states that practice slavery. In California, you have 744 people on death row, but you have an average an execution every 25 years, if you ever have. But practitioners, the ones who do it, Texas, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, Florida, all of which practice slavery. And that has been built into the penal code, the harshness of punishment in the South. And it goes way back into the history when slaves were freed and white people were afraid, and the harsh penal code went in, and it's been in ever since.
So your life's journey, your vocation is becoming more and more aware of where Christ is present on the fringes, in the periferia, and for you, in prisons, in New Orleans and in Louisiana. But you have been able to defend and to be advocating for persons, especially innocent people. You have found yourself also up against a wall of either indifference or incompetence. Tell us a little bit about that part of your journey, that your commitment towards ending the death of innocence.
Right. I'm going to say something briefly about that, but I'm realizing there's a really important thing that I need to talk about before we talk about innocence, and that's about the victims' families.
Go to that right now, Helen.
Okay,
please.
because the encounter with Christ is, if that person on death row is worth more than the worst thing that person's ever done, what about the victims? Where's Christ? Yeah. And Christ is always going to be on the side of the victims. So here, and I tell this in Dead Man Walking, the parents who lost their children that night, November night, when Pat and Eddie Saunier killed them in that sugarcane field, when I did meet them and I met them, at first they were very angry at me, which I deserved. I hadn't even written to them. And they see me at the pardon board hearing. And why am I at the pardon board hearing? I'm there to ask the state not to kill Patrick Saunier, but I wasn't there for them. And the father of the boy who was killed, David LeBlanc, was just 17 years old. He invited me into his heart. And he said, "Sister, I pray in this little chapel. Come pray with me." And I went, and I prayed with his father. We prayed the rosary together. It was on a Friday. So on Fridays, you remember the suffering mysteries in the life of Christ. And I'm praying alongside a man who's praying through the agony and death of his only son. And he took me then into his journey toward redemption and forgiveness. And the way he put it to me was the pressure that was on him as a victim's family at first. Because he said, "Sister, everybody was saying to me, Lloyd, you gotta be for the death penalty or to look like you didn't love your boy." Oh, yeah. And I realized the importance of culture. See, if you've had an ultimate loss of your child and you don't ask for the ultimate punishment, what's wrong with you? Everybody was saying that to me, he said. And you weren't there for me either, sister. All the time you were visiting the two brothers, but you never came to see me. And then he said, with all those people saying that to me, he said, I went there inside my mind and my heart and my imagination. He said, I've always been a person who likes to help people. I've been that way since I was a kid. It makes me happy to help people. But I was losing that because I was picturing myself putting both those brothers, only one of them got the death penalty, putting both those brothers in an electric chair, and I was pulling the switch slowly. I wanted them to feel pain because of what happened to us. I almost lost my wife from mental distress, almost lost her. I wanted them to feel pain. And he said, I went there, and I would imagine it, and I would feel it. And then finally he said, I realized I was losing my happiness. I was snapping at Eula, my wife, my daughter. And then he put his hand out like this. And he said, then I said, they killed our son, but I'm not going to let them kill me. Wow. And I'm going to go down the road Jesus called me to go down. When Jesus had said, you've heard it said an eye for an eye, and I could see what it was doing to me. And he was the first victim's family I ever met who taught me that when you enter into forgiveness, you're saving your own life. Yeah. And he's the hero of Dead Man Walking. I'm just the storyteller. I made a terrible mistake. And in all the art forms in which this story is told, in the film of Dead Man Walking, in the opera of Dead Man Walking, which is here in Fresno and it's in Modesto, that crunch point where I am confronted by these victims' families at this pardon board meeting, and their anger and their pain, and in the opera it's particularly strong because they're singing, you don't know what it's like. You don't know what it's like to see a child go out the door and you never see him alive again. But then the death row inmate character in the opera, Joseph DeRoche, his mother is singing, you don't know what it's like to see your child slip through your fingers. And I'm in the middle, in over my head, making mistakes as I went along, but then growing into the understanding. And what I understand about Christ is when you look at the image of the cross, victims on one side, perpetrator on the other, Christ in the middle. Christ calls us to be that one who is the reconciler in the sense is that we are called to see the dignity in both. We need to reach out to victims of violence. We need to reach out to people in prison. And I got cast into that role, learned in it, and that's the road I've tried to go on ever since.
We need to take our 1-minute break, Sister, right now, but we'll be back with the rest of the program in which Sister will once again share the depth of her own journey towards understanding the mystery of Christ in all of this that we are talking about today. We'll be right back.
KNXT, the nation's only full-powered broadcast station owned and operated by a Catholic diocese in the U.S. and streaming live on the internet at KNXT.TV, need your support to keep the message of the good news alive. Just go to KNXT.TV, click on the Make a Financial Gift, go to Donate, and fill out your one-time or monthly offering under PayPal. It's just that easy. Your donation makes it possible for KNXT, Catholic Television, to continue its ministry by celebrating the Mass and proclaiming the Gospel. Thank you from KNXT.
Welcome back to FaithWorks. As I said, we have a very special guest in the studio today, Sister Helen Prejean, who is sharing with us her own journey as she became aware of the need to minister to people, victims, and even perpetrators of horrendous crimes. Today, we're going to talk about the mystery of innocence and how she has seen that reflected even on death row, and maybe she'll share with us her letter to Pope St. John Paul II, and recently a visit to Pope Francis over this horrendous issue of capital punishment. Sister Helen, pick up where you'd like about your connection with Pope John Paul II.
Well, we were talking about innocence. So when I first got involved in writing A Man on Death Row and being with him, I never dreamed. It would be a fluke if a person was innocent.
Oh,
okay? Yeah. And so I've now, with the 7th person on death row, continued to accompany people. 3 out of those 7 have been innocent.
Wow.
And in The Death of Innocence, the book, I talk about 2 of them, Dobie Gillis Williams from Louisiana and Joseph Odell in Virginia. Well, always it's because they didn't get good defense. They couldn't get the forensic evidence, the DNA test, whatever they needed to prove that they were not guilty. But with Joseph Odell in Virginia, Italy got involved in this case.
Oh, yes.
The Italian Parliament got involved in this case, and Pope John Paul got involved with the case of this man, Joseph Odell in Virginia. I was his spiritual advisor. I was brought in to help him along with the team of people working with him. And it led me to finally, when he was executed, to accompany his body through Rome, where he was buried in Palermo. But I got to encounter and meet Pope John Paul. So before I met Pope John Paul in person, a personal letter was delivered to him for me. And I had a question for him, because I had been with the guilty for the dignity of even of the guilty, that they shouldn't be strapped down and rendered defenseless and killed. But now I'm beginning to also these innocent people like Joseph Odell. So in the letter to the Pope, and one of the things about dialogue and the sensus fidelium, the sense of faith in the whole church, the Holy Spirit's with all of us, and dialoguing with the Pope is no different than talking to you.
Beautiful.
Because suddenly you don't have your Pope talk or whatever it is you do to talk to a Pope. It's the same conversation. And one of the things I said to him in the letter was, Pope John Paul, do we only uphold in the church the dignity of innocent life? And we're pro-life, so I get it. We're for life, the dignity of life, before a child's born, down to the end of the spectrum where somebody with Alzheimer's doesn't even know their name. But and I said this in the letter, when I'm walking with a man to execution, it was Pat Sonia I was thinking of, and he has leg irons on, his hands are handcuffed to a belt around his waist. He's surrounded by guards. And I have my hand on his shoulder, and he says to me, "Sister, please pray that God holds up my legs while I make this walk." And I said, "Your Holiness, where is the dignity in taking a man, rendering him defenseless, and killing him? Where's the dignity in this death? Is it only the innocent that have dignity? What about the guilty?" And so my letter got in there to him. I wasn't the only one. I'm not like some Catherine of Siena goes, talks to the Pope, changes his mind, all this stuff. I'm just part of the dialogue. That's what community is for us, right? But it got to him. The letter got to him. And one of the things that Pope John Paul did, he did 2 things. He changed a part of the catechism. The part, I think it's 1066. It's the only number in the Catholic Catechism I know. Am I right? Is it 1066?
2266?
2266?
It's an awesome number.
Yeah, awesome number. Yeah, remember, it might help you with bingo or something. I don't know. But at any rate, the criteria that the Catholic Church had used for 1,600 years to justify when the state could take life was that it had to be for a grave or grievous crime. And what the Pope did was he eliminated 10 words out of the catechism before it was changed for the definitive edition in 1997. And he eliminated the words grave or grievous crimes. And then in his own encyclical, The Gospel of Life, which came out 2 years earlier, He had said, when we have a way to defend society, we have a way to keep society safe. The state doesn't need to kill. So you have both of those things now, that you have a way to keep society safe without killing. That's what life sentences in prison are for, which he brought out. And then, on the other hand, you remove the criteria. So no matter how grave or grievous the crime, and one of the things I said to him was, when states or any government executes, they will always claim this is a grievous crime. In Kenya, you have a baby out of wedlock, they wait till the baby's weaned, put the little mama in a hole and stone her to death, because they consider that a grave or grievous crime. How are you going to let governments decide what they consider to be a grave or grievous crime? So then the Pope, when he came to St. Louis in '99, this is after the catechism had changed, and for the first time he put the death penalty in with the other pro-life issues. And he said no to abortion, no to euthanasia, no to physician-assisted suicide, and no to the death penalty, which is cruel and unnecessary, because we have a way to keep ourselves safe. And then he added, even those among us who have done a terrible crime have a dignity that must not be taken from them. And then the Catholic Church, from that moment on, that was in '99, we began to move, because there was a telling statistic. We weren't batting too well.
Oh, no, no.
In '96, it showed that 78% of the of the population in the United States supported the death penalty. 98%, and 78 and 80% of Catholics.
Yeah.
We were supporting the death penalty
more
more than the population. And the more people went to church, the more they supported the death penalty. But then the education began. The key thing that Catholics now bring out is the dignity of the human person, and now we're leading the pack in terms of a moral group, a denomination that's working to end the death penalty.
And I think a perfect bookend, Sister. We have about 3 minutes. If you wanted to close the program with maybe your more recent visit, your very recent visit with Pope Francis, who reaffirmed and became very connected to you over a particular case. Can you share with us?
It's a man by the name of Richard Glossop in Oklahoma. Innocent, and Oklahoma's ready to put him to death. I got involved. He asked me if I would be with him when he was executed. I looked into the case, and I knew he was innocent. I began to be involved. We began to get out on media, began to reach out to get the word out, to create doubt about this. Look at all this. This man's about to go to his death. Look at all the questions. And I called through a special contact I have, because I know it's close to the heart of Pope Francis. All the marginated, all the people whose voice is never heard. You know, he's got showers in the Vatican for the homeless. And I wrote, and could you pray for Richard Glossop, and just let Richard know you know his name and you're praying for him. That was all I asked him. And he did get involved, and he sent the papal nuncio to the governor's office, intervened. And when I went to visit with him on January 21st, as part of the Year of Mercy, I met with him on a special mission. And it was to deliver to him a letter from Richard Glossop thanking him for helping to save his life. And the Pope's concern, when I met with him that day, January 21st, a man by the name of Masterson had been executed in Texas the day before. His one question to me when I met him was, he said, yesterday? And I said, they killed him, Pope Francis. And he just lowered his eyes. He had tried to intervene with the governor of Texas not to kill Masterson. And so his heart was just so in it. But I got to deliver that. And then just on Good Friday, I visited with Richard Glossop on death row in Oklahoma and told him all about the Pope's visit.
We are going to have another program. You can check it out on YouTube. Another interview with Sister Helen Prejean and with Matthew Buckman from Fresno Grand Opera. We want to hope that you'll read Sister's books and that you'll go to our website to find out more resources to become in touch with Sister. Till next time, God bless.